Okay, hi
Yes.
everyone. Thank you again for attending today, and this is the last session in today's training program, training package. Hi Christian, thanks. And so this is sort of like a companion piece with Stefania's on Twitter that was like platform specific on Twitter before lunch. So here I'm going to focus on YouTube research. Again, I'm going to focus on networks, but I am going to touch on a couple of other things that you can do with YouTube. It's not YouTube research is not only about networks. So I will kind of mention those sort of other options in passing, but that's kind of the main bulk of the presentation will be showing you how to do a network that looks a little bit like the one you can see on the screen there. And specifically, YouTube analysis, as I said, that looks at those kind of video recommendations that you see down that up next sidebar on YouTube. Okay, great. Okay, so I'm just going to cover a couple of points in this like the short presentation with some slides. As before, the slides are in the Google Drive folder with a separate for. In fact, I'll quickly show you the folder. The slides are there, and there's also 3 folders that contain some data sets, and I'll do a demo with one of those data sets. But there's some data sets there, so which we presented you with. I mean, that was so that you could, we were planning, obviously, when we were in person, you could do some practice in class with these data sets, but these data sets are still there for you to use. But if you want to have a bit of practice, but hopefully by the end of this presentation, you also have a good idea about how to collect your own data. And there's a Google Doc there, which gives you the basics on collecting video network data with YouTube data tools. So that's something you can follow along as well kind of after this session. Okay, so yeah, so the overview of this kind of like slides presentation part is the first part I'm going to cover is thinking about data collection, and in particular thinking about some of the things you need to be aware of around Twitter data collection, around the API, the quality of that data, which is generally good, I should say, but being aware of what it can and can't do in your research. And then I'm going to say something about studying, in particular, algorithmic recommendations. And then we'll move on to a little bit of a demo about how to do the network analysis. Okay, so first, thinking about data collection. So the good news, so sort of before lunch, Stefania had a slightly sad story about Twitter's academic API access and how that is, although it is currently seems to be still working, everything we've been led to believe means it will be disappearing at some point, or at least that very like high quality API data source will be disappearing. YouTube has a very useful API, application programming interface. However, unlike that sad story about Twitter, the good news is, at the moment anyway, YouTube's very useful API is still running completely normally, and we've had no kind of like, there's been no indication from YouTube about, you know, cutting off access to this API. Excuse me. The good news is this is a bit more like a stable and robust data source. As I said, it's very important to be aware of what the data does and doesn't do. But what we don't currently have is the situation that we were talking about before, where there's like a sort of a selection of different like scrapers that you could possibly use, and sometimes these scrapers, sometimes they work really well, sometimes they don't work well, and it can be a little bit unpredictable. and for their performance. This is not currently a problem we have with YouTube. So the link now on the slide takes you to this page that I'm showing here. So this is the YouTube data API. And there's lots of documentation on YouTube's website, its developer website, telling you all the different kinds of data that it provides. So I'm not going to go into that here. It's presented in reasonably clear language. It is aimed at like tech developers, but it's not too difficult to parse, I don't think. So I think yeah, there's some useful information there. If there are things that you're not sure about when you start to use the YouTube data tools package, and you're getting data but you're not sure what it means, that's this is one of the best places, or probably the best place to look. If you want to know more about APIs, and I think when you're doing digital methods and research, I mean, I think some of the questions that you've posed today have been like really important because they've spoken to the kind of the platform context and the political context of the platforms that we're looking at, and how these are not, as I said before, neutral kind of media spaces. They all have their biases in particular ways, and often these biases come from like the corporations that own them. And APIs are a really important part of that picture. And API access and APIs that researchers can access, because APIs are an important tool with which social research can be done. So if that API access does or does not exist, that in itself is an important thing to talk about in your research. A really kind of like classic social science paper about these issues is by Anne Helmond there, which I've put on the screen, but it's also in the references at the end of these slides, called A Platformization of the Web. And Anne provides some really clear descriptions and definitions of what an API is, and in particular she works through the example of Facebook, and how this idea of how APIs can move data from a platform around the web, and APIs enable parts of a platform to appear in different parts of the web, and that's really what makes platforms platforms. So I really recommend that as a really like key paper in the digital media literature. So it's from 2015, but it's really a very important place to start getting to understand what APIs mean, because we talk about them a lot, and if you're doing digital methods research, you're probably going to use them in some way. So that is so important, like methodological background. Okay. So with any API, if you've got some coding skills, I mean computer coding skills, so like being able to use Python or R or something like that, you know, you'll probably be able to access data direct from the API through the command prompt on your computer. However, a lot of people, myself included, are not particularly skilled in that area. So some tools exist, including this one I'm about to discuss, which very usefully provide like an interface between the researcher and the API, and one that's relatively, well, very easy to use in this case, and pretty easy to understand. So the one we're using here is called YouTube Data Tools, which was created by Bernard Reeder, who you can see on the screen there, from the University of Amsterdam. And this really is a way of using the API to extract the data. And there's a screenshot there, so it's like a kind of like a text-based interface. And in fact, what I will do is just quickly show you in slightly more detail. So what you see at the front, on the front page here, is you get a little bit of background information, which is extremely useful, and has some very, very useful links in there. So I recommend you take a look at those, including like FAQs and an introductory video. But there are various what they call modules on there, which help you to extract data from different parts of the platform. And you can think of these as being related to some of those different digital objects that were discussed earlier on this morning. So there's some quite basic ones that give you like information about channels, and also ones that are more like video specific, and also one down the bottom here about video comments. So I just make quick reference to this. So some of these you'll see are called lists. So you can get like lists of channels, and you can get video lists, which are the kind of like the initial search results that you would get from a particular query when you go onto YouTube, and it suggests you like a list of videos. You can do some really interesting research around that, but we're not going to look at that today. We're going to focus on the networks. This module here, the video networks. As it says here, create a network of relations between videos via YouTube's related videos function, which sometimes is called up next, or what you certainly will know it has, as I said, is that sidebar down side of the YouTube video page. Okay. So what can it do? So YouTube data tools, or YTDT, as I'll refer to it from now on, it provides a robust, stable source of data. So this is really useful and important, and certainly at least one of the YouTube papers that I mentioned this morning in the first talk uses, I believe, yes, YouTube data tools in order to collect the data. So there are really strong academic papers in the peer-reviewed literature that use YouTube data tools in order to obtain data. So I think that's something that's important to emphasize. So this is now becoming like a well-known and well-accepted means of doing YouTube social research. And as I said, there are many options such as channel info. So this just enables you to extract some basic info about a particular channel. As I said, it can give you some search results from a particular search query. So it might tell you, for example, the top 10 videos or the top 100 videos presented to users if they search for climate change. Channel networks. So this is relations between channels. So these are subscriptions and relations between different channels, which is useful for identifying particular clusters of interest and clusters of channels who have relationships with each other. So that can be useful, particularly if you're looking at kind of like sources. So some of the questions that came up earlier, particularly around kind of like conflicts or social movements. That's the sort of thing where it might be really useful to identify kind of different sources and how they relate to each other and how they link or don't link to each other. Video networks that we're going to look at in a bit more detail shortly. That's those up next videos, and those user comments, which someone mentioned earlier. And in fact, this has recently been had an upgrade on YouTube data tools, so it's a little bit more powerful now. And this is probably the one part of the platform or the tools which sometimes works not quite as well as the others, but that's purely sometimes because of the weight of comments. So some videos may have many thousands of comments, which and the larger those numbers become, there's a little bit more risk involved, I think, in the data collection. So but there are now ways of restricting the number of comments you get around, particularly, let's say, focusing on the top 100, what are deemed the most relevant. So these are the ones that are kind of like algorithmically sorted on the page. So there are ways now of kind of like honing that. I won't talk about that anymore, but I know a lot of researchers are often interested in looking at comments. So I just want to flag up that that's there, and it's a much more, by extracting the comments and putting them into a spreadsheet, it provides a much more easy to manage way of doing analysis and like trying to do it on a YouTube video page on your screen. So this is all great, and as I say, this API data is really robust. It's an official source provided by the platform, so we can be reasonably confident about its kind of like robustness. But even if we were to assume that it was like a completely like perfect data source, there are some limitations that we really need to be aware of. And in particular, I think it's useful to think about how the data that we're collecting through an API aligns with what a user will experience on a particular platform. Okay, so what do I mean? So I've talked about what it can do, so what can't YouTube data tools do? So the API does not tell us everything that's going on the platform. So for example, there are some key things missing. So things like video watch times. So we can extract the total length of a video from a list or like from a network. We can look at a particular video and identify that it's 30 seconds long or 1 hour long, and start to think about, you know, what a particular perhaps what the most popular and the most engaged with duration of videos are. So are there certain issues where videos are kept quite short? Are there others where it seems like users or the platform are promoting things that maybe are a bit more in-depth and a bit of a deeper dive? So we can see the video duration, but what we cannot see is the video watch time, by which I mean how long the users watch a particular video for. Are they likely to watch it the whole way through? Do they tend to switch off after 30 seconds? This is really important information that the platform records, that YouTube records, but they don't offer it to us in the API. The second one there, which I've highlighted in this page on the right hand, on the little screenshot on the right hand side. So we have, as I said, this kind of video recommendation data, which is super interesting and super useful. But a recent kind of introduction is these buttons that go along the top, which are like topic-related buttons. So these are a way of kind of like filtering down those recommendations. And you'll actually see that if you go to YouTube.com, so YouTube's front page as a user, you will almost certainly see a list of these buttons, kind of like topic-related buttons going across the top of the screen that's immediately trying to guide you towards particular like, subtopics. So the platform does not provide specific information about what's under these buttons. Not clear. I don't think we have any kind of like user research on how used these are being, how much these buttons are being used by YouTube users. But they are fairly prominent, so I think we can assume that they have a certain level of importance. So we have the kind of like information about those recommended up next videos, but we don't have information related to those specific buttons. One more thing, really important thing that we don't have information about in the API is adverts. So adverts in particular, as I'm sure you'll know if you've watched YouTube for any length of time, if you watch 1 or 2 videos, you'll have kind of 1 or 2 short adverts appearing in between, and some of the media interest and commentary interest in YouTube, content of some of these adverts, and in particular some of these adverts are placed by activists or political parties, and that seem to have some kind of like problematic content, or even, you know, problematic content can also be non-political, for sure. So we're not provided with any information about adverts. So again, that's one part of YouTube's user experience, and a really important part, I would say, which doesn't feature in the API. And then one more thing I really want to mention, which in the case of YouTube, I mean, on all platforms it has a certain level of importance, but on YouTube it's particularly important, is what I've called the personalization problem. So YouTube users receive personalized and localized recommendations in their search results and in those sidebar videos up next. And as I mentioned earlier, I can't remember who it was who mentioned the Fortet video within my kind of like screenshot. That was certainly a personalized recommendation because it wasn't related to what was actually on that like screenshot of that YouTube video that I was showing. The video was actually a digital methods video, yet I was being recommended this music video. So that's a very good example of something that was a very specific recommendation related to my search history or my watch history rather than what was on the screen at that particular time. Now, if you stop and think about it for a moment, you know, it's actually pretty impossible to collect data on that kind of thing through the API, because by their very nature, these are like individually crafted search results, or at least that kind of personalized element are very like individually crafted. So these recommended videos that we extract through YouTube data tools do not tell us the whole picture about what a YouTube user will see related to a particular video in that sidebar in their account. So this presents a challenge to researchers to how to research a platform that looks slightly different, or perhaps even very different, to every different user. Now, there are some what I would call like digital ethnographic approaches around, which kind of are very much, if we're talking a lot about big data today, I'd say there's some very small data approaches which attempt to see how particular actions like liking a video or creating a profile in a particular way will affect that personalization, and taking like very close detailed records of how the platform changes what it presents to you, depending on quite, you know, micro level interactions you might make on the platform, like liking a video or watching a video. And those are very, very promising approaches, but they're very much like on a kind of like a micro, like one account level. So they'll tell us something really important about dynamics. But what we're doing here is a much more a big data approach. So what can we do while still acknowledging this personalization problem? So the paper on the right here, which lead author is Bernard Reeder, who I showed earlier, was the author of the YouTube data tools. This is like a really key paper in the YouTube literature around ranking algorithms and ranking cultures. So the part I'm going to sort of just briefly pull out here is that it makes the point that biases are built into the platform, and that is for commercial reasons. And you know, the one thing that you need to remember about YouTube is that the whole platform is targeted towards keeping you on there for as long as possible. The longer you stay on YouTube, the more adverts they can show you, the more money they make. That is, you know, on a very crude basis, you know, what the whole platform is geared towards. But these biases present like a real sort of tension with researchers, the social researchers' desire for objectivity. So this necessitates multiple approaches to platform research. So as I said, about that kind of like persona-based sort of small data approach. But in these networks that I'm going to show, we're going to focus on what Bernard Reeder and others call the baseline perspective. So what this is an acknowledgement that API data certainly plays a key role in shaping what YouTube users see, but it's not the whole story. So there'll be some personalization in there. There'll be some, you know, videos which seem a bit off topic, which are based on watch history or search history, might be mixed in with a user's recommendations, but we can't get at those because they are so individually crafted. But we're seeing this kind of like baseline perspective on what YouTube thinks video relations are based on their content, and also based on user behavior. So it's not the whole story that we're seeing here, but we're seeing a very like important part of the story. Okay, so that's the kind of methodological part out of the way. And I think some of those points are made there sort of carry over to other platforms as well. No matter how sort of impressive the amount of data you can sometimes extract from these platforms through APIs, we always want to sort of keep in our mind how it compares to what a user will experience. And there'll always be some kind of misalignment there. So it's always, when we're thinking about the limitations of our study, it's always important to keep those in mind. Okay, so briefly, and I've already touched on this today, I'm going to just sort of say something about algorithmic recommendations and that kind of like public interest, an academic interest in studying them on YouTube. And there's quite a bit of literature on this, and I've flagged up a couple of sort of early interventions here. The one on the left-hand side by Ben Apchifsky is actually taken from the New York Times. This was actually quite a small data approach, but she talked about YouTube as like this kind of, perhaps a great radicalizer. And on the right-hand side, you can see Derek O'Callaghan and others talking about down the white rabbit hole. They're talking about the role of YouTube recommendation systems in what they talk about presenting sort of incrementally more extreme content to YouTube users. So they may move from what perhaps is like might characterize as like a mainstream right-wing perspective to something where they end up users may end up being shown far more extreme right-wing content. So I'm not going to get into the kind of sort of much of a discussion about that and the sort of critique of it, but what I want to flag up here is this is clearly like an important issue, and linking back to what I said at the start, this problem about public scrutiny or public oversight of these platforms and the lack of regulation in the area means that sort of we're reliant on research to kind of uncover some of these relationships and some of these dynamics. And there's clearly some like very sort of public interest imperatives in studying some of these things. So, hopefully it's clear that these are sort of important issues. And more broadly, you can relate this to something you might call like the politics of attention, which is a phrase that's used by a few authors, but I've flagged up this really nice review article, quite a recent one, 2021, by Pedersen, Albrith, and Nick Seaver, talking about the political economy of attention. So this is a way, and this I think is a nice way to think about the kind of networks that we're going to look at in a moment on YouTube, is how YouTube, if you start from a particular video or a particular search term on YouTube, how the platform directs your attention to particular groups of videos or particular parts of, perhaps a big issue, or perhaps might take you towards adjacent issues. And through these like recommendations, these kind of like incremental recommendations through the sidebar, YouTube perhaps starts to shift your attention towards other, they have to be related to your original search term, because remember, there's no kind of like commercial interest in showing you something completely unrelated, because they want to keep you on the platform. But also this idea or this underlying assumption that keep you interested, it has to like slightly change or slightly modify this material you're being shown. So yeah, quite a few articles around and quite a nice literature on the politics of attention, but this, yeah, is quite a nice review article, which is worth a look. Okay, so this is, so just before I kind of start doing the demonstration, this is a, no, this was the network that was on the first slide, and this was from a project I was involved in at the University of Amsterdam, where we mapped the YouTube recommendation network around COP21, which was the big climate change negotiations that happened in Paris in 2017, I think, if I remember rightly. Yeah, we were interested for people who were looking for COP21, which was the name of the kind of like the name of the talks or the hashtag associated with the talks. If you use that as a search term on YouTube, what kinds of videos started to be recommended in the sidebar? What kind of videos were you taken to, and then what kind of videos were you subsequently recommended? And so what's happened here is that there are a lot of nodes on this network. So the nodes, obviously the little circles, and every circle on there represents a video. And the links between them, the edges between the nodes, recommend they are directional, and they represent if someone, if you're on one video and you recommended another video from there, then there is like an edge between them. It's a large network, and it's like the network is too large to kind of like show the individual labels and individual video names, at least in this kind of like wide view. So what we did here was kind of look at these clusters. So we used a kind of modularity approach and technique, which Stefania showed in the Twitter talk, and identified some like clusters and themes within these videos. So this really sort of helps us to map out the COP21 and climate change more broadly is like such a huge, complicated, amorphous issue, has lots and lots of different elements to it. So this is quite a nice way of kind of like doing some what you might call issue mapping. That's not to say this is like an objective piece of issue mapping, but it's mapping what the issue looks like on YouTube and what the kind of key elements of COP21 as this event and as part of climate change as a wider issue. What are the key elements that are being prominently presented to YouTube users? So it's interesting in that, you know, some of these clusters are related, are kind of like related to particular geography. So you can see there's a group of videos from Brazil, there's a group of videos related to France, because that was the host nation. There's a separate cluster at the top around, specifically around French activism. And then interestingly, we've got a kind of a personality related cluster on the top left-hand side of the red, around Prince, was then Prince Charles, now King Charles III, I think making an appearance at the talks, if I remember rightly. So there's so you can see that these clusters, mapping the issues, you start to see, if you want to sort of refer to, say, Latourian, the kind of theoretical approach, you can see that some of these actors are not all, they're not all the same kind of thing. So some of them are particular geographies, some of them are charismatic individuals like Prince Charles, and some of them maybe, you can see at the bottom there, actually we have something about Al Jazeera and something about particular oil companies. So the sorts of prominent actors are very different kinds of humans and non-humans. Okay, so very quickly, that's just a list of the references that I used there. So what I'm going to move on to now, I'll just, if anyone wants to jump in and ask a question about anything I've said up to now, then now's a good time to do so. And I will just, well, I'm just getting the data out here, and I will get the Gephi fired up and show you something. I say there's some crossover, so there'll be a chance to sort of recap on a couple of things that Stefania did, but as I said, it's a very different kind of network. Okay, so I'm going to open the one on climate change, and I've put in each of these folders, I've put two files. So there's the main file, which is this .gds file, which is the network file which you open get. But one thing I did, which I think is useful to flag, and I find it useful when I'm doing this kind of work, is I just put like a screenshot of the how I collected the data. So when I went into YouTube Data Tools, I after I started the data collection, I just took a screenshot of the kind of the part of the window where the settings are, because there are quite a few settings on there, and there's quite a few different sort of combinations you can use. And I think it's kind of like a useful way just to, like an aid memoir to kind of what you did. Particularly if you start using this start doing this kind of data collection, start doing this kind of research, what you'll quickly find is you'll probably do quite a lot of data collection as you kind of experiment with different search terms and different countries and different sizes of data sets. So this is quite a nice way to record what it is that you've done, that's then quite easy to refer back to. because yeah, it's quite easy to get lost quite quickly if you start collecting a lot of data. One thing I want to flag here is that, so very quickly, so there's more detail about this in the Google document, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this because it's fairly straightforward. But there is a search query box here, which is fairly self-explanatory. So that is the box that you would, the same way that you would search for something on YouTube itself. There are some optional parts here about relevant language and region code. So the region code is basically country. So it's trying to replicate the country that you are, the user would be sat in, if you like. And if you don't fill that in, it's very important to note that it defaults to the US. So there is no like default objective global view in YouTube. You have to select the country. And it is quite nice because you can do some like country comparisons in YouTube using this function. Just to note that for this particular example, I've used GB, which is great. And then there is a space for iterations, and that can be between 1 and 10. An iteration of 1 means that you start with a list of 50 videos. And if you go up to 10, then you start with a list of 500 videos. But if you're looking at networks, the networks get very, very large very quickly by just increasing those numbers quite slightly. So a very good kind of principle is to start small. Because sometimes if you try and collect a lot of data, although it can be tempting to collect a lot of data or try and collect a lot of data, you may cause some kind of like crash or problem downloading. It can be very frustrating, but it's taking a long time to download and then it crashes right at the end. It's a source of frustration. So I would always start small, and if you feel like you need some more data, then go back and do another collection. And then finally, one thing I want to mention down here, which there's more detail on this in the Google Doc, is about something called crawl depth. And there's only 3 options you can put in of 0, 1, and 2. So crawl depth is like a network sort of related term, but what it means in this particular context is the number of like recommendations that you might that you're looking at. So I'm looking at crawl depth 1 here. So I'm starting off with a list of 50 videos related to climate change, and I'm looking at the next video or the list of videos that are recommended like 1 step on. So it's like 1 set of those sidebars. If I've gone to crawl depth 2, then the network would include the next subsequent set of recommendations after that. So if you can imagine, it's almost, it would be like watching 3 videos in a row rather than 2. But due to the kind of mass of networks, and there is indeed a warning on YouTube Data Tools website that crawl depth 2 can lead to networks that are almost too large to deal with. And indeed, even if you do manage to collect the data successfully, whether you can get it to work in Gephi or any other network software is perhaps a bit doubtful. You certainly need a very powerful computer to do so. So I recommend going for crawl depth of 1 because it enables you to map out the issue and this idea of the different parts and different clusters within the issue. Well, it gives you probably a network of maybe about 3,000 or 4,000 nodes. We'll check that in a minute. But for this kind of work, for this kind of like issue mapping, if you like, this is a good, normally a good place to start. Okay, so I am going to download this file. Do generally find if I drag it. Yeah. Okay. So So similar to what Stefania showed earlier, so we get this import report, and in fact, much larger than I said. So we've got 1,700 nodes, approximately, how many videos we've got, and we've got 25,000 edges. So that looks okay. It says there's no issue being found. So we're going to open the network up. And again, similar to what you quite often find when you open a network up in Gephi like this, you get this kind of like hairball or just an actual real life black box, which we need to disentangle. Fortunately, we can do that fairly straightforwardly. Okay, so we're going to choose a layout, and as we discussed earlier, we're going to start with Fourth Atlas 2 and press run on that. And it's looking fairly stable. Fourth Atlas 2 never quite stops vibrating and trying to correct itself, so you basically just need to stop it at some point. And you can kind of scroll out a bit here, and you can see a kind of very interesting network here. There's a couple of clusters that are kind of a long way removed from the main one, so there's a lot to sort of analyze here, which looks interesting. So that's actually quite a nice network. Sometimes what you might want to do is, if it's still looking a little bit sort of too clustered, I might sort of increase the scaling a bit. This is probably a good thing to look at. So the default scaling is 2. So let's just try that and then put that up to 4. And that just kind of spaces it out a little bit more. And you can sort of keep, you know, tweaking these different settings as you wish, but I'm fairly happy with that at the moment. So I'm just going to run one of those statistics that Stefania ran this morning. So I'm going to look at modularity. So I'm going to run that now. Okay, that's good. And it's important that you have to run these, because if you don't run these statistical tests in the sidebar, you need to run them for them to appear as like an option. So what we can do now is, so it's already selected. It's a little bit small on screen there, but it's this kind of like little color palette icon, which not surprisingly refers to the color of the network. And what I want to do is I'm going to select an attribute. So there's various different ways that you can kind of colorize the network. And I want to do it by modularity. And as we saw earlier, and as you saw in that network that I just saw, that I showed you from before, that COP21 network, we have some different clusters that are detected here. Okay, so one additional thing we can do is, again, as we said earlier, so we can do something about the node size. And this is a way of making some of the nodes, and remember the nodes are all videos, making some of these kind of more prominent. And you know, there's a couple of different things that we could do because there are quite a few digital objects that are associated with YouTube videos. We have a few different options here. So we could look at things about like the number of comments. So we could vary the size of the node according to the number of comments if we're particularly interested in kind of reactions to which videos have been most reacted to. We could do it around like counts, so perhaps we look to make the most liked videos, the largest nodes. Similarly, you can do something around view counts. What I'm going to do here is something around in degree. So in this context, in degree is about the video recommendation. So which videos are the ones that are the most recommended? Which videos appear the most frequently in those up next sidebars? And I think that is an interesting and kind of relevant thing to take a look at. So this tells us the kind of the span of the sizes. So let's do this again. And we'll play around with that. You can see that has made some of these a bit larger, but I'm actually going to figure there and see what happens. Okay, so that's good. So now we have some videos that are really showing up quite prominently. So these are videos which are appearing most frequently in these up next recommendations. Okay, and then one last thing we might want to do is go to the labels, and we can label the nodes, which is going to make it very messy temporarily. But if we change that to node size, as we did earlier, it's still a bit messy, but we can do something. Font size like that. And then we start to get something that's a little bit more readable. Now, if you were going to present this in a piece of research, you'd want to do things like doing the label adjust and pulling the nodes apart a little bit to make sure that the labels are readable. And again, you can do things like Stefania did earlier, in which you might, only show the labels associated with some key videos. But I'm not going to go into that here because I don't want it to take too much more time. But what I think you can immediately see here when you start to look at this is you start to get a flavour of what kind of videos are in parts of this kind of like issue map, if you like, through these video recommendations. So we have some kind of like sort of science-based videos here, more about sort of climate economics there, economics explained. Quite a hopeful looking one there about saying that we will fix climate change. I'm just going to pull these labels apart a little bit. I'm not sure one could say to do over it. Yeah, stop that for the moment. So, and then what we can start to do is, if you're a kind of like a, I mean, you can do this on Gephi, but if you're kind of like a manual person like I am, what you might want to do is like print the network off on a large piece of paper and start doing this manually in terms of identifying like particular clusters. So we can zoom in on a particular cluster and have a look and get an idea about what is going on here. This is one that is looks like broadly science-based. We have one here which is definitely about some things to do with economics, but then interestingly, we've definitely got like a bit of a right-wing cluster here. So we have something right-wing / like climate skeptic clusters. We have a video from Jordan Peterson, which doesn't actually look climate related, interestingly enough. We have one on longboard. We have one about actually a theological one, including Douglas Murray, who was a prominent commentator. We have some climate skeptics here, so like Richard Lindzen, Bjorn Lomborg. So we have quite an interesting already sort of like cluster going up here, which is definitely more kind of like climate skeptic / right-wing content, which is interesting to think about when you think that these are videos that are pretty easily accessible from that initial climate change query. And I'm not going to offer like any sort of commentary on whether this is like a good thing or a bad thing, whether this should be part of what YouTube offers or not. But it's certainly a constant topic of commentary and academic interest about what kind of content appears to users when they type in a query like climate change. And one thing I will quickly just flag up here, which I think is really interesting, and linking back to the point I made before about this kind of like political economy of attention, and actually it also links to one of the questions or one of the points that was raised this morning about kind of biases on the platform, is we have some videos here that really don't look climate related at all. So we have one here about the Nord Stream pipeline, and this seems to be related to other ones to do with the Russia-Ukraine war. So we've got one here called Russian commander losing confidence in Putin. We've got one about the Chinese foreign minister. All kinds of things going on. Are you ready to build wealth in 2023? There's a very sort of seemingly like not related to climate change group of videos here, which are being recommended to users pretty rapidly once they've looked at climate change video. And I'd suggest that's the sort of thing, that's a very sort of specific thing that we can see quite quickly about how YouTube is directing the attention of users, in this case, away from the issue that they initially search for and towards other kinds of content. And very finally, one thing I'll just flag here, just to show that you know, clusters may not be issue related. Sometimes they can be channel related. So sometimes you can end up on a video from a very sort of prominent and highly subscribed channel, and you end up in this kind of like smaller ecosystem that's related to the channel. And you can see that really clearly here in the video title, that these are all from ABC News. So by getting, and this is Australian ABC News, so you can actually get from climate change into this whole kind of like subsection of more kind of like general news from the channel pretty quickly as well. So definitely, I think some researchers might look at this network and think, yeah, this is a clear example of YouTube, particularly on like what's a really important topic, issue such as climate change, how YouTube is not keeping users' attention focused on what they were looking for, but is quite quickly diverting them into other issues, which may well be important and may well have a particular political slant to them. But to think of it as an issue map of climate change, actually there's a lot more going on than climate change. It's an interesting way you can both think about sort of prominent parts of the climate change debate, but also how the platform has a very clear role in shaping user attention.